Night fell over the city, and Jonathan found himself alone at home. His wife, Sarah, had left for a business trip, leaving him with the feeling of loneliness that always accompanied him when she wasn't around. The house, an old three-story building that they had inherited from Sarah's grandparents, was in gloom, with only the soft creaking of wooden planks for company. Jonathan walked through the house, feeling strangely uncomfortable in the stillness. It was an autumn night, and the wind was howling outside, making the trees brush against each other. The room seemed even more gloomy due to the old furniture and dim lighting. He had planned to take advantage of the night to catch up on the work he had accumulated. His office was located on the second floor of the house, and that was where he headed. Upon entering the room, he turned on the computer and began reviewing some documents. However, the feeling of loneliness and the oppressive atmosphere of the house prevented him from concentrating. As the night wore on, Jonathan felt increasingly restless. The occasional noise from the old house made him jump, and the creaking of the wooden boards sounded like whispering voices. He tried to attribute these sounds to the old age of the building, but a nagging feeling that he was not alone persisted. Finally, around midnight, he decided it was time to finish work and try to sleep. He got up from the table, turned off the computer, and turned off the office light. As he left, he felt as if something was watching him, hidden in the shadows in the corners of the room. Downstairs, as he headed to the kitchen to get a glass of water, he realized that the feeling of being watched wasn't leaving him. Every shadow on the walls seemed to come to life, dancing across his field of vision. He tried to dismiss these thoughts as mere creations of his tired mind, but the feeling of restlessness persisted. Climbing the stairs towards the bedroom, the feeling of oppression increased. The shadowy corridors seemed to narrow around him, and the images in the paintings on the walls seemed distorted, almost demonic. Once again, he tried to blame it on his imagination, but something kept him from being convinced of it. Upon entering the room, Jonathan turned on the lamp next to the bed, illuminating the room with a soft, yellowish light. The bed was empty, and Sarah's absence increased his feeling of loneliness even more. He lay down, closed his eyes, and tried to ignore the feeling that he wasn't alone. Time passed, and Jonathan continued to lie in bed, unable to find sleep. He turned from side to side, the feeling of being watched never leaving him. It seemed like something was lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. It was then that he heard a sound coming from the hallway outside the room. There were soft, shuffling footsteps, almost inaudible. His heart raced, and he stood still, listening intently. This couldn't be real, he thought. It must be his mind playing tricks. But the footsteps continued, approaching the room. With each step closer, the feeling of uneasiness intensified. His body was tense, and he could barely breathe. It was as if something was slowly approaching, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Jonathan wanted to scream, but his throat felt as dry as sand. And then, the footsteps arrived at the bedroom door. The doorknob began to slowly turn, as if someone was trying to enter. Jonathan stood helplessly paralyzed as the door slowly opened. The bedroom door continued to slowly open, creaking as if it hadn't been used for years. Jonathan was frozen in bed, watching with wide eyes as the darkness of the hallway swallowed the entrance. He couldn't see who was on the other side, only shadows moving in the dim light. A figure approached the door and entered the room. It was indefinite in the darkness, an obscure silhouette that seemed to glide across the ground. Jonathan felt a shiver run down his spine, the feeling of restlessness now reaching its peak. He wanted to scream, but his body felt frozen with fear. The figure approached Jonathan's bed, and he could feel the presence there. A chill ran down his spine as the figure began to whisper unintelligible words, as if calling his name in a strange, dark language. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he tried to move back on the bed as much as he could. The whispers were disturbing and chilling, as if the figure was trying to communicate with him in some way. The words were incomprehensible, but Jonathan could feel something terrible was happening. Fear gripped him completely, and he finally found his voice. With all his strength, he screamed, a shrill scream that cut through the night air. The figure's whispers abruptly ceased, and the presence took a step back. The light of the lamp next to the bed illuminated the figure for a brief moment, revealing only an undefined shadow. Jonathan didn't wait to see more. He launched himself from the bed and ran towards the door, ignoring the fact that he was only in his pajamas. The figure retreated into the hallway, and he saw it disappear into the darkness. The house seemed to be empty again, but Jonathan's heart was still pounding in his chest. He ran down the hallway, turning on every light he found along the way. He wanted to make sure the figure was no longer there. As he checked every corner of the house, he found no one. All doors and windows were locked, as they should be. Jonathan picked up the phone and called the police, explaining what had happened. He was shaking with fear as he spoke to the operator, and the feeling that something was wrong persisted. The police promised to send a squad car to check the house, and he was grateful for help on the way. While he waited, Jonathan stood in the living room, the light on, trying to understand what had happened. Was the figure he saw in the room real? Or was it all just a hallucination caused by fear and loneliness? He wasn't sure, but the feeling that something dark inhabited the house deeply disturbed him. The night had turned into an anxious wait. Jonathan remained in the living room, the lights on, waiting for the police to arrive. Every shadow on the walls and every creak in the house seemed to whisper dark stories in his ears. Finally, the sirens of the police car broke the silence of the night. Jonathan ran to the door and opened it, greeting the two police officers who arrived. They listened to his account attentively, although they seemed skeptical about the presence of a mysterious figure in their home. After checking all the rooms and entrances to the house, the police found no sign of a break-in. All doors and windows were locked, and there was no evidence of forced entry. They suggested it could have been an intruder who managed to escape before their arrival. Jonathan was frustrated and confused. He knew what he had seen and felt, but there was no tangible evidence to support his claims. Police officers promised to keep an extra patrol in the area overnight, but their presence was not enough to dispel the feeling that something was wrong. After the officers left, Jonathan returned to his second-floor office. He decided to investigate on his own, determined to find out what had happened that terrifying night. He began by scouring the history of the house and the neighborhood for clues. It was then that he encountered something disturbing. An old newspaper dating back decades mentioned a series of unexplained events that had occurred in the area. Witnesses claimed to have seen shadowy figures on the streets at night, and several houses in the neighborhood were said to be haunted. Jonathan also discovered that his own house had a sinister history. The house was rumored to be haunted by vengeful spirits who had been summoned in dark rituals performed by a man known to be obsessed with the occult. That man had died in the house under mysterious circumstances. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place in Jonathan's mind. He began to suspect that the figure he had seen that night could be some kind of supernatural entity linked to the house's dark history. Stories of summoning rituals and vengeful spirits became more plausible with each discovery. He decided to investigate the house further for clues. During his search, he found a basement he had never fully explored. The cellar door was stuck, but he managed to open it with effort. The darkness was oppressive, but he had a flashlight on hand. As he descended the stone stairs, the temperature in the basement dropped sharply, and the lantern began to blink intermittently. Jonathan felt a sense that he was not alone, as if something was watching him from the shadows. Even so, he continued descending. In the basement, he found strange objects and old dusty books that seemed to be related to summoning rituals. The feeling that something was wrong only grew, and he began to question his decision to explore the basement. However, he was determined to unravel the mystery surrounding his house. It was then that he heard the sound of whispering again, as if ancient voices were echoing through the basement walls. It was as if the shadows had a life of their own, whispering incomprehensible words. Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine, but he continued forward, following the sound of whispers. As he approached a room deep in the basement, the door to the room was ajar, and he cautiously pushed it open. What he saw left him speechless. The room was full of lit candles, a circle around a strange symbol drawn on the ground. In the center of the symbol was the shadowy figure he had seen in his room that night. She was kneeling as if she was performing some kind of ritual. The whispers seemed to emanate from her, and her body shook as if possessed by a supernatural force. Jonathan was paralyzed with terror as he watched the scene before him. It was as if he had stumbled upon something terrible and forbidden, something he shouldn't have discovered. The mysterious figure was now aware of his presence, and turned to face him with empty, haunting eyes. Jonathan was petrified before the mysterious figure kneeling in the center of the basement room, surrounded by lit candles and enigmatic symbols. Whispers echoed in the air, creating a terrifying atmosphere. The figure slowly turned to face him, and its empty, lifeless eyes seemed to penetrate Jonathan's soul. The fear that dominated him did not let him back down. Instead, he felt a wave of determination wash over him. He knew he needed to face the unknown and discover the truth behind that sinister figure. With hesitant steps, Jonathan approached the figure, still holding the trembling flashlight. He asked, with a trembling voice, what was happening and who that presence was. The figure did not respond with words, but its eyes remained fixed on Jonathan. It was then that Jonathan realized that the whispers he had heard were, in fact, words in a strange and ancient language. He didn't understand what was being said, but the feeling was that the figure was trying to communicate in some way. The whispers were unsettling, filled with a dark energy that made the air contract. With the flashlight still in hand, Jonathan asked the question that had been tormenting him since that night in the bedroom. What do you want? The figure continued to whisper, but now its gestures became more frantic, as if it was trying to convey an important message. Jonathan realized that the only way he would understand what was happening was if he himself delved into the shadows and tried to decipher the whispers. He turned off the flashlight, plunging the room into complete darkness except for the dim light of the candles. The figure continued to whisper, and Jonathan closed his eyes, trying to concentrate on the words. The sound of the strange words echoed in his mind, and he began to feel a strange connection with the figure, as if they were sharing thoughts and memories. The words began to become clearer and more understandable. The figure was revealing a terrible story. Decades ago, a man who lived in the house, obsessed with dark and occult rituals, performed a summoning ritual in the basement in an attempt to obtain supernatural powers. However, something went terribly wrong during the ritual. An evil entity was summoned and took over the man. The entity had been trapped in the house ever since, unable to leave it, and the man had died under mysterious circumstances during the ritual. Jonathan felt a rush of horror as he absorbed the story. The figure was a victim of this entity, trapped in the house for all these years. She was trying to communicate, seeking help to free herself from the dark hold that held her prisoner. With the information he had received, Jonathan realized he had no other choice but to confront the entity and help free it. He turned on the flashlight again and approached the figure. This time, there was no fear, but rather a fierce determination in his eyes. He began talking to the entity, asking it to free itself and leave the house alone. The figure whispered words in response, and the room seemed to vibrate with intense energy. The candles around her began to flicker, and the shadows seemed to take on a life of their own. Then, with one last whisper, the figure disappeared into the shadows, and the room fell silent. The evil presence that had haunted the house for so long was gone. Jonathan felt a deep relief, but also a sadness for the figure who had fallen victim to the dark ritual. He left the basement and locked the door, determined never to enter that place again. Jonathan knew the house still had a dark aura, but it was now free of the evil presence that had imprisoned it for decades. The experience had left Jonathan deep scars, but it had also awakened an understanding that the world was full of dark, inexplicable mysteries. He had learned that sometimes it was necessary to confront the unknown to find the truth and bring light to the shadows.